Next, we'll move on to adding photo-based textures, and these are textures that are created by capturing a photo. I have some examples here. There's chiseled wood, a dirty wall, foil, foil inverted, and glitter. I'm going to try applying the foil inverted, so I'm going to go to File, and then Place, and I'll choose that foil inverted texture, and I'll click on Open. I don't know if you'll get this message or not, but I'm just going to go ahead and just click OK, and then I'll click OK one more time, and that places that foil texture into my painting. Now what I'll do is I'll set the composite method of that layer to overlay, and then I'll take it and I'll move it into place. Maybe I want this to be on top of the plane, so I'll need to transform this a little bit. I want to go to Edit, Free Transform. It's okay if we convert this into a default layer, and then I'll go to Distort, and I'll simply just drag the corner points to match up with the corner points of my plane. Then I'll click on the check to commit, and that easily I've applied that texture. I'll need to then move that to the appropriate layer, which will be right above the plane surface, and I can play with the transparency of that layer to get a more subtle blend. So now our objects here are hovering above this nice foil surface. Now in this case we got lucky and the light source is coming from the right angle, but if it wasn't, you need to rotate the image so that it faces the light source, and then transform it into perspective. Let's put that foil on the sphere. I'm going to select the sphere layer, but we'll take a look at a different way to apply it this time. I'm going to take that foil image and I'm going to drag it here into Corel Painter and drop it. That opens it as its own separate document. Then I'm going to go to Select All, and I'm going to look for my Textures panel, and in the top right subdialog of that, I'm going to choose Capture Texture. I'm going to name that Foil Inverted and click OK. Now that's added this to my Textures library, and again, if I wanted to create a custom library, I can do that. Again, the advantage to doing that is then I can export that library, and then I'll have a backup of that library saved, because if I reinstall Painter and all of my custom textures are in the default texture library, they'll just end up getting thrown away. So I'll jump back over to my primitives. I'll create a new layer above the sphere using Select Layer Content. I'll set it to an overlay layer, and this time I'll use one of my texture brushes. This is the Texture Airbrush. I want to make sure that I've selected my foil texture so that it's active. And I can paint in some foil. Now that foil shape is a bit too big. If I show the texture, you can see it's gigantic, so I want to go ahead and transform that. And I want to make it way smaller, something like that will work. Go ahead and hide the texture, switch back to my brush and paint. And now I get my nice, bright, shiny foil ball. And I can, of course, play with the opacity to control that as well. If we hide the foil texture from the background, you can see that a bit better. If we want to further enhance the appearance of realism, we can select Bulge, and we can bulge that out a bit from the center. Let's add one more texture to the cube. I'm going to go to File, Place. Let's select Dirty Wall. We'll just place it in. We'll set the composite method to overlay. I'm going to hit Control-T to free transform, and I'm going to scale this down. If I hold Shift and Alt, I can scale it from the center without squishing the aspect ratio. Take it and just scale it down here until it fits. Click on the check to commit. Go to that cube layer, select the front, go back to the dirty wall. I want to invert that selection, then I'll hit Delete to clear, take that and move it down to the appropriate layer, reduce the opacity, and now I have that nice texture on my cube. You'll probably notice that all of my textures here are black and white textures, and that's because most of the time when I'm using textures, I just want the texture. I don't want the original color of the texture that I captured in the image. So for example, on the wood, I wouldn't want my texture to always be brown because maybe I'd want to use this on an object that's not brown. So it makes more sense to just apply the texture separately and then make the color of the object whatever color you want it to be, whether it be green or brown or red. The color is on a completely separate layer than the texture. And then depending on the composite method that we choose for our texture layer, it's going to blend with that color. Overlay is going to blend both the light and the dark values. Multiply is going to blend just the dark values and exclude the light. And screen is the opposite. It's going to blend the light values together and exclude the dark values. So you can use colored images for your textures, but I recommend that you make them black and white. To do that, you could use something like Photoshop, or you can do it in Corel Painter by taking your color image, flattening it down to a single layer, and then going to Effects, Tonal Control, Adjust Colors, and then simply just reduce the saturation all the way down to nothing. That'll remove all of the color. You want to make sure you do that to a copy of your image, that way you're not saving over your original color image. For photographic textures, a bigger image is better than a smaller image because a smaller image is going to look kind of blurry if you try to put it over a big canvas. There are also lots of apps out there that can capture textures using the camera on your smartphone. For example, there's the Adobe Capture app. You can take the camera on your smartphone and point it at something like the wall or the carpet or tree bark. It'll show you a little preview of what the texture might look like, and you can capture that texture. It automatically tiles it for you, and you can control how the edges of the tiles blend together to instantly create a tiled texture pattern. Now I say pattern because this is kind of more of a pattern than a texture. It repeats so regularly that it doesn't look that organic, but it might work well for some circumstances, so it's definitely something to check out. Now let's take a look at another form of texture, which is impasto. Impasto is normally created by the difference in elevation in your paint. So for example, thick paint sticks up more and is more elevated up off your canvas, whereas thinner paint is spread out flat against the canvas and you don't really notice it as much. The thick paint picks up highlights and shadows, whereas the flat paint doesn't. As a whole, this creates texture in both the objects in your painting and in your painting as a whole. Let's go ahead and add some impasto to the sphere layer. I'll use my select layer content trick. I'll create a new layer and I'll set that to overlay. Let's look at our brush categories for the impasto category. Let's go ahead and select Gloopy 2, and let's choose this neutral gray color. Let's paint in some gloopy paint here. Now it does paint off the edge of the object even though I have select layer content active. So that is something that I don't like about it, but there is a workaround. What we can do is we can invert our selection by going to select invert, and then on that impasto layer we can select the eraser, and we can just erase the outside there. Control D to deselect, and there we go. Now it's important to note that this impasto is kind of a separate entity. It's not really on a layer. It's on its own separate impasto setting. And so if you go to Canvas, Clear Impasto, you can completely remove it, or you can show and hide it. You can also control the direction of the surface lighting. This presents a few issues because if you want the impasto to be editable, you need to save as a RIF. But if for some reason you wanted to save your artwork as a PSD, that impasto is going to be no longer editable. So let's take a look at that. Let's go to Save As, and I will save this as a copy, and I'll close it. And then if I reopen the file and I go to the impasto layer, and I go to Canvas, Surface Lighting, and I manipulate the surface lighting and put it on the other side, you can see that the lighting doesn't change. That's because this impasto is no longer editable. It's just been flattened down into a single layer of pixels. So you still have the appearance of the impasto, you just can't work with it like it's wet paint like you could if you saved it as a RIF. I'm going to go ahead and delete that example. I'm going to go ahead and clear that layer. Let's go back to that gloopy brush. Let's add in some more gloopy paint here. Now let's go to Save As. This time I'm going to save as a RIF. I'm going to close it. I'm going to reopen it. And now if I go back to that impasto layer and I go to Canvas Surface Lighting, I can take that light and I can move it, and I'm changing the lighting on the impasto. So you can see it actually changing there as if it's three-dimensional. So that means that it's still editable. So then if I were to go to another impasto brush like Depth Equalizer, and I paint, you can see that I'm eating away at that impasto, and that's still live as if it's actual thick paint that I can work with. So if you want the impasto to remain editable, save as a RIF. If you want to permanently apply it or fix it to your canvas so that you could open this in another application like Photoshop, for example, then you'll just need to save it as a copy, as a PSD. So I've gone ahead and jumped back over to the PSD that I saved earlier that has the impasto fixed and no longer active or no longer wet. And now that it's in that state, I can select something like the blur blender, and I can zoom in and I can blur along the edges of that impasto to get rid of that jagged edge. And really, since these are pixels, I can do anything I want with it. If I wanted to go in and blend it, for example, I could do that as well. Another great way to add impasto to your paintings is to use Artrage. I'm in Artrage 5 right now. I'm going to go to File, Import Image File, and I'm going to locate my primitives PSD. I'm going to look in the Layers palette here, and very similar to Corel Painter, I have all of my layers in groups. So we could go to that sphere, we could select the sphere, we can right-click on it, we can choose New Stencil from Layer Contents. That's the same as the Select Layer Content trick in Painter. We can create a new layer. We can right-click on that and set the blend mode to Overlay. And we can select the Oils brush, select a neutral gray color, and we can paint in some impasto. Now I don't have to worry about painting off of the object because I have my nice stencil there. I could also select something like this paint tube if I want a more gloopy result here. And I can even use stuff like this palette knife to go ahead and smudge that around and plow into it. I can also add glitter, which gives me some really nice textures as well. I want this to look kind of scaly and bumpy. We can check out some of the other presets here. There's bubble mass if I want it to be lumpy. And then when we're done with the stencil, we can right click on it and we can choose remove this stencil. And now we have our texture on a separate layer. And we can of course again save this by going to export image file. We'll export it as a PSD. I'll save this as a copy so I don't save over my original. And I can open that in something like Photoshop or Corel Painter if I like, and I can continue working on it. So a way that I might use this impasto effect is for portraits or paintings where I want it to look like I've created each individual brushstroke with oil paint. So here's an example of a portrait I created. I can create a new layer. I can set that to a blend mode of overlay and select that neutral gray color. If I want it to be exact, I can go to color picker. I can put that up on screen. So I can make sure that my hue is at 0, my luminance is at 50%, and my saturation is at 0. That gives me a completely neutral gray, and I can select my oil paint brush, and then I can go in here and I can paint in some strokes. Now this is a pretty subtle amount of impasto, but I can go to the presets here and I can choose something like thick gloss. And this will give me a much more noticeable result. So I can paint kind of in the direction that I'd be painting if I had painted this with individual brush strokes. And really this is kind of faking it, because if you wanted this to look realistic, then you would have used an oil brush from the beginning and actually painted each individual stroke. But this works also, it just doesn't quite work as well. But you don't want to do all your strokes in the same direction. You want to change them up a little bit. You want to have finer, smaller strokes on the finer, smaller areas, bigger, broader strokes on the bigger, broader areas. I'm following the contour of the hair because that's what I would do if I was painting each stroke individually. And I'm being pretty quick and pretty sloppy about this, but if you're doing this at home, you would want to spend a little bit more time to make sure that it looks pretty good. Then if you wanted to, you could select your palette knife, and you could blend it a little bit in some areas to take it away. Go back in with your brush, add in a little bit more. If you want it to really bulge out in some areas, you could take your paint tube and you could put in some big blobs of paint, and then take them and smudge them around to get some kind of chunkier texture results. Do that here on the nose to make that bulge out a little bit. And if I zoom into that, you can see there's these nice little blobs and chunks of paint that look realistic. So that's yet another way you can use impasto. And then the last method of adding impasto isn't entirely digital. It actually involves printing your digital art first, and then using an acrylic gel medium to embellish over it to add the impasto. And similar to how I applied the impasto on an overlay layer, you could do the same thing to a print of your artwork. Here's some examples of embellished prints that I created. Here's a giant golden heart collage and some smaller examples of prints.